Case of the week. We're going to say this kid's name is Max. We're going to say he's 8. I changed identity and gender, everything to protect the kids. But basically, Max came to see me because of high anxiety, learning problems, OCD, separation anxiety, where he would just cling to mom. And the mom's like, we don't know what the heck is going on. And they had worked with an OT, they'd done all this stuff. Nothing had really made a difference for Max. And just like I brought up before, we just presume that things are the way they are, right? People are just anxious, that some people just have learning problems, and that's just the way life is, right? Well, in the case of Max, what happened was such a surprise to me because usually I see good results, but in this case, I was just like, what? Mom, you saw what? So, what was the case about Max, and how is this relevant, and how does it matter to you? Well, it matters to you because when you look around, there are a hell of a lot of people and kids who have anxiety to some extent. And sometimes it shows up in one part of life, another time it shows up in another part of life. How cool would it be if you knew everything possible to leverage to make sure that your kid can learn as efficiently as possible? And this conversation is very relevant to that. Because in this 8-year-old, there was actually a big error that was missed that could have really disabled his ability to learn for the rest of his life and basically had Max grow up to feel like he's dumb, except this kid is not dumb. He's actually a really smart kid. He just couldn't learn. So Max's story was that, he was doing fine, and around 4 to 5 years of age, he started having some anxiety. By 5 years of age, he was having intense OCD and meltdowns and all of these different things. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, is this hormonal? Is this hormonal? What else is going on? Is it a gut issue? Because that's what a lot of people think, right? And then the story kept unfolding. And by the time he was 7 and 8 years of age, mom and the school and the teachers are like, this kid has some kind of learning disability because he's just not learning well. And the mom is like, yeah, Max is just distractible and he's just kind of all over the place. And people think he has ADHD, right? That term that we just throw out all the time without really thinking about what ADHD is, right? And one of the telltale signs, and I kept drilling mom and asking her all kinds of questions. One of the things that came up was, what happens to Max when you're in a really crowded space, like when we actually used to have parties, if you're in a party with Max and then you tell Max to do something like, hey, Max, can you go get this or that or whatever? In crowded spaces, how does Max do? And mom is like, no, Max can't hear me. Max doesn't hear me. I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, yeah, I have to repeat myself like 15 times to get Max to understand what it is that I want him to hear. And repeating yourself multiple times, especially when things are loud and crowded, may be something that's happening to your family, whether it's your kid or maybe your spouse or niece, nephew, your kid's friend. These kinds of things are all over the place. We just don't know how to look for them. Now, what does this mean, and what relevance does that have to do Max's ability to learn, and how is this relevant to you and your kid and making sure your kid is learning optimally, right? Well, it turns out that when there's too much sound information coming in, and the brain has what is called an auditory processing disorder, auditory sound processing disorder. So it has a disorder in how efficiently it can process sound from the world around it. When there's too much information coming in at one time, guess what happens? These auditory pathways basically short circuit. I'm way oversimplifying this because otherwise it wouldn't help. But essentially, these auditory pathways that go into the brain, and especially the brain's ability to handle all this auditory sound information, basically fritzes out. So in the case of Max, when there was too much sound going on, his brain would just short circuit, and his brain was just like, the hell with this, I can't handle it. Max would get freaked out in loud and crowded spaces. He would get overwhelmed. He would withdraw. This is a telltale sign of an auditory processing disorder. These kids do not do well in loud and crowded spaces, and it's part of a larger sensory processing. But in this case of Max, it was specifically with sound. He was actually really good in all other areas. So I told mom, like, hey, why don't we find a auditory processing specialist, and they exist, and there's actually a program called ILS, Integrated Listening Systems, that can assess this, and there are therapists like this all over the country. Max went to go see one of these specialists. They assessed him, and the specialist literally was just like, holy Jesus. Max has one of the most classic severe cases of an auditory processing disorder I've ever seen. 2 months later, after doing some therapy, I get in touch with mom, and mom is like, he's more calm. His anxiety is markedly decreased, not completely gone, markedly decreased. Max is no longer stuck to me at the hip. He's not the barnacle kid that I had. And this is the coolest part. And the kid who was learning disabled is now suddenly learning at an astronomically fast rate. Mom is sitting there and she has him listen to audiobooks, and he's actually processing what the audiobook now says, and he's enjoying it, whereas before it was a pain in the butt. He can actually attend class and take in the information that the teacher actually wants to share with him. So learning disabled, suddenly 2 months later, not learning disabled. And it doesn't mean that in 2 months the entire auditory processing program was done. But that is how much change came about in this kid with just this simple thing. And I was going all over the place. I'm like, maybe I should treat his gut. Maybe I should do this. Maybe I should do that. And because Sam was so overwhelmed, we just decided to do one thing. And when she told me that, I'm like, wow, that is so cool. But these are the kinds of possibilities that are available to you all if you just know how to identify the error that is there. And had Max gone and seen someone else, they probably would have looked into his gut and let's treat the diet and let's get rid of gluten and let's put him on magnesium and let's do this. Max's brain couldn't process sound. And these kinds of errors are way more common than we realize. And if these errors are present in your kid, they're present in you, they're present in your niece, nephew, spouse, it makes life astronomically harder. Learning becomes astronomically more difficult because you can't process the information that people are trying to tell you. It's not because you're dumb, it's because your brain can't process. It creates anxiety because you get overwhelmed from too much information stressing out your brain. And these are essentially disabilities that we could so easily take care of if we were just aware of it and knew what to do with it. And I hope that you can help me get this information out there. I hope you can help me make every parent aware that these kinds of things exist. Because you know what? Kids don't need to suffer like Max did. We don't need to have disabilities when a simple treatment can actually rewire the brain and help these kids learn. So what I want to ask you is to help get this information out. Get more people to watch these videos, get more people to become aware of these things, because every parent should know of this. Because if it's not your kid, if it's not your spouse, it may be your kid's friend. There's someone out there in your circle that probably has something like this. So get this information out there. Let's make the world a better place for all these kids and adults, because you know what? These aren't just issues that happen in kids. I am sure that at least a handful of you watching have this error. And when you look, you're like, yeah, I don't like loud parties. Yeah, when things get too crowded, yeah, I do get a little stressed out. Yeah, when I was in school, I did have a hard time kind of listening. It's because there was something going on in your brain and it could be fixed. And you know what? You could still do it now. As an adult, I'm doing occupational therapy because I'm like, well, God, I've got these things. So instead of talking about it, I should do something about it. Just because you're 30 years old, 40 years old, doesn't mean you can't rewire your brain. I'm an ancient dinosaur in comparison to my daughter, but you know what? My brain is still capable of learning some new tricks. So let's get this information out there. Let's make the world a better place for all these kids. And despite all of this weird chaos that we have going on around us, let's at least do one thing to make the world a brighter place. And thank you for helping me do that. This is Dr. K. Thanks for watching.